Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
New bruises or kiss marks? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy it! It was Saturday night and the sun had just set, casting a twilight that made it difficult to decide whether or not to turn on the headlights. Mark Evans didn't have to make that decision because he had already pulled into his garage, located on a quiet residential street in Sharpsburg. Soon, a slender dark-haired man came out of the side door, carrying a briefcase and a laptop bag. Thanks to years of experience handling these items with ease, it was impossible to travel as much as he did without developing such skills. He opened and entered the side door of his house, but did not call his wife, Lisa, to inform her of his return. He already knew that she was not at home. Instead, he walked into the living room with his briefcase and laptop, leaving his briefcase at the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor of their modest but cozy home. He placed the two items on the sofa, took off his coat, and hung it in the closet by the front door on the usual coat rack. Now with both hands free and in the comfort of his own home, he removed his jacket and tie and unbuttoned the top two buttons of his white shirt. He usually didn't wear such formal business attire, but today he returned from a regional management meeting for ABC Industries. He wasn't technically in management, but his role as the most knowledgeable systems analyst in the enterprise required his presence at meetings in Pittsburgh. His immediate supervisor was good at organizing staff but knew virtually nothing about the computer systems that kept their business running smoothly. He could have returned home the night before, but that didn't suit his plans. Instead, he told his wife that after the meeting, there would be a series of seminars that would last the entire weekend and that he would return on Monday. He had his reasons for this and had to waste most of the day to avoid coming home too early. He also wished he could pack more comfortable clothes for this trip, but if he did, Lisa might wonder why he needed them. He never wore anything other than business attire to these regularly scheduled business meetings. Now that he was home, the first thing he did was take a shower and then change into more comfortable clothes. 20 minutes later, after he had disappeared upstairs with his backpack, he returned to the ground floor dressed in his usual jeans and polo. Freshened up after a quick shower, he spent the next half hour selecting, heating, and eating food from the leftovers in the refrigerator. Lisa was a good cook, and even her leftovers were delicious. He washed down his meal with a bottle of light premium beer, one of his few indulgences. By the time he finished his beer, he had moved into the living room, where he was stretched out in a recliner, reading the front page of the local newspaper. To any casual observer, he was a typical husband relaxing after a long and difficult trip. In reality, he was simply stalling for time, strictly following his plan, and patiently waiting for the right moment to bring his personal crisis to an end. He had a month to go through the 5 stages of grief alone, and in truth, the only stage he handled successfully was denial. Anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance still played a role. At that moment, he hoped to advance several of the remaining stages during the night. It was past midnight, and Sunday had just begun when he was finally satisfied with what his watch was showing. He stood up to return the empty beer bottle to the kitchen counter. While there, he moved the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and wiped the table with a damp cloth, returning it to a clean state. He knew that by doing these small tasks, he was just prolonging the inevitable, hoping that his doubts and fears would force him to reconsider the path he had chosen. When no new solution to his problem presented itself, he went to the hallway closet for a light jacket and then headed to the side door, beginning his nightly mission. When his fingers touched the doorknob, he suddenly pulled his hand away, snapped his fingers, and said, "Damn, I almost forgot." He hurried back into the living room, placed the case on the coffee table, and then placed the laptop on the case. In less than a minute, he turned on his laptop, logged in, and connected to the internet through the wireless router located in the computer room. He and Lisa had set it up, and a few minutes of typing and emailing completed the forgotten tasks. After logging out and turning off the laptop, he returned to the side door confidently and leisurely, leaving the house. After spending about 5 minutes in the garage, he lifted the garage door, pulled out onto the street, turned on his headlights, and drove away slowly as the garage door closed silently behind him. At 7:37 p.m., the Sharpsburg 911 operator responded to a new incoming call. "This is your 911 operator. What is the nature of your emergency?" A vague female voice, seemingly young, answered through a poor phone connection. I think I need the police." I think a crime has been committed." The 911 operator continued calmly, "Where are you, ma'am? We need your location to dispatch the police." I am on Park Drive at the phone booth on Park Drive next to George Washington Park." The mention of the phone booth clarified the poor connection for the operator. "What type of crime was committed, ma'am? Were you attacked or robbed?" There was a slight hesitation before the young woman responded, "No, it's not me. I'm fine. I just ran through the park on the paved road that goes around the picnic areas. There's a car parked outside one of the picnic areas. The doors are open, the light is on inside, and there is blood." The 911 operator was now very interested in the call. "Will you need an ambulance? Is there anyone injured?" "No, there's no one there who was injured. At least I didn't see anyone there. There was only an empty car." After a brief pause, the woman continued, "I didn't look around too much. I was afraid that someone might come after me, so I ran here to the phone booth to call you. You did the right thing. I'm sure the car has already left and the officers should be there in less than 10 minutes. Please wait for them so you can tell them exactly where this car is." The caller, sounding a little worried, replied, "No, I'm not going to wait here. What if whoever did this comes for me? I'm going to go straight home." Her last words were followed by a click as she hung up. The 911 operator stared helplessly at the screen as the flashing image of the caller's number disappeared after the phone was hung up. Damn, I guess it was just her idea of a joke. Well, I hope I didn't distract these officers from something more important than their coffee break. It was almost 2 p.m. that Sunday afternoon when Detective Peter Nesbitt suddenly sat up straight in his chair as he saw a car turn into Evans's driveway. He was getting out of his unmarked car when the beautiful short-haired blonde driving the car stopped him in front of the garage. He was walking quickly across the street when she got out of the car and he quickly said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mrs. Evans." She turned, grabbing her duffel bag from the seat next to her, and answered, "I'm Lisa Evans." She looked at the detective again and continued, "Do we know each other?" "No, ma'am. I'm Detective Peter Nesbitt with the Sharpsburg Police Department. I'm here about your husband, Mark Evans. We're trying to locate him after his car was found abandoned in George Washington Park this morning." He quickly returned his ID and badge to his pocket. Lisa Evans's face showed a moment of serious concern before she said, "Mark is in Pittsburgh. He always leaves his car at the airport when he goes on these trips, so I don't know how it could have ended up in the park. You must be mistaken." Detective Nesbitt approached her and continued, "No, we are absolutely sure that this is his car. The license plate matches his registration." Her face now showed confusion as she slowly walked towards the side door of her house. "Well, if it's his car, then it must have been stolen from the airport. I don't know what else to tell you." The detective, quite persistent, spoke again. "When was the last time you spoke to your husband? Can you call him now so we can make sure he is still in Pittsburgh? Does he have a cell phone that we can call?" Lisa Evans stopped abruptly and turned to the detective. She placed her travel bag on the ground next to her and began searching for her cell phone in her bag. "He called me yesterday afternoon from Pittsburgh. If it makes you feel better, I'll call him right now." She punched a few numbers into her phone, eager to show the detective that her husband had not been at the park. A moment later, the cell phone began ringing in the detective's jacket pocket. He took it out and held it to his ear before saying, "Hello?" Mrs. Evans's expression of surprise was absolutely sincere. After a moment, when the shock had subsided, she said, "Where did you get my husband's phone number?" The detective turned off the phone and put it back in his jacket pocket. When she said, "You need to give me back my husband's phone." "He must have lost it," he replied. "I'm afraid I can't, Mrs. Evans. This is now evidence of a possible serious crime. It was found on the floor of your husband's car." Lisa was again concerned and asked, "Serious crime? What do you mean?" "Your husband's car was found early this morning in the middle of George Washington Park. The doors were open, and there was a bullet hole inside the passenger seat. We searched the park thoroughly but did not find anyone who might have been harmed. We really need to find your husband to rule him out as a victim or suspect. Can you call him at the hotel in Pittsburgh?" Lisa turned towards the house, picked up her travel bag, and said, "Sure, I can do it." I have the hotel number in my notebook. He always stays at the same Holiday Inn. I'm sure he just forgot his cell phone in the car, and that's why it was there when his car was stolen. Come in and we'll sort this out." Detective Nesbitt followed her into the kitchen and watched as she set down her bag and wallet, found her address book, and quickly began dialing a phone number. Looking absent-mindedly across the hallway into the living room, he clearly heard the hotel manager say, "Hello, hello," as she hung up. As she hung up the phone, her face turned pale, and she quickly said, "Mark was home. His briefcase and laptop are on the coffee table in the living room. I don't understand anything." The detective had a thoughtful look on his face as he pulled his cell phone out of his inside pocket. He quickly dialed a number and said, "Hey Dave, Pete here. I need you to contact the duty prosecutor. I want a search warrant for the Evans home. We need to search the place to determine whether Mr. Evans is the victim or a potential suspect. Bring it here as soon as you get it. I'll be waiting." He hung up and sat down opposite Lisa. "A search warrant? Why do you need one? You can look at anything you want, just ask." "I want to do everything legally, ma'am. If I conduct an illegal search and your husband turns out to be involved in something illegal, then whatever I find may not be admissible in court." Lisa was a little annoyed and quickly replied, "Illegal? Mark isn't involved in anything illegal. He works with computers, for God's sake." "Well, something brought him back to town unexpectedly. Can you think of any reason why he might be here unexpectedly and without informing you, his wife?" Lisa's face turned pale again, and she quietly muttered, "God, no, he can't." A panicked look appeared on her face as she silently looked at the detective for several seconds. Finally, she said, "I don't know why my husband came home early. I just know he's not involved in anything illegal." Her face gradually took on an expression of complete panic, and she continued, "Oh God, Mark might be injured, lying somewhere, and waiting for help. You have to find him." Seeing how upset she was, Peter Nesbitt's compassionate side took over, and he spoke to her much more gently. "We don't know anything for sure yet, Mrs. Evans. As a police officer, I have to do the right thing. At the moment, there is no evidence that your husband did anything wrong or that he was even involved in this. Why don't you make us some coffee while we wait for my partner with the warrant? There's nothing more we can do right now. All of our duty personnel are looking for or keeping an eye on your husband." His sympathetic tone and comforting words seemed to help Lisa as she began to relax, and some of the natural color returned to her face. She stood up and started making coffee for the two of them. Her calm state did not last long, however, as with his next proposal, Lisa became tense and worried again. This happened when he said, "Perhaps while we're having coffee, you can tell me how you spent the last 48 hours. Before this case is closed, we'll probably need statements from everyone who was in any way involved." Detective Nesbitt decided to wait a few minutes before taking a preliminary statement from Lisa Evans, and she seemed reluctant to broach the subject herself. Instead, the two of them sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while the detective recounted the details of how the car was found and the condition it was in. Lisa seemed shocked by some of the details. He also described that there was evidence that a second bullet had been fired into a body leaning against a piece of wood on the ground next to the car, and that bullet was in the process of being removed for testing in their forensic laboratory. The car was towed away for inspection, and evidence was still being collected from it. Finally, he reported that the medical examiner and forensic investigator were still examining the scene in detail. They had just started their second cup of coffee when Detective David Clean, Peter Nesbitt's partner, arrived much faster than expected with the search warrant that had been requested. He was accompanied by two forensic technicians, and soon the three new arrivals began a systematic and thorough search of the Evans home, including Lisa's garage and car. While this was happening, Detective Nesbitt arranged for Lisa to locate her husband's razor and toothbrush so that DNA could be obtained to compare with the blood samples they had. Throughout the search, especially when it came to DNA comparisons, Lisa was so stressed that Detective Nesbitt was eventually forced to take her to the living room, where he asked her to stay on the couch while he joined the others to complete the search of the house. After an hour of seemingly fruitless searching of the house, the detectives decided that the only things they would need to take from the station, aside from the DNA samples, would be Mark Evans' briefcase and laptop. Detective Nesbitt had already discovered that the computer was password protected, and they would not be able to access it until they found a way to bypass it. Mrs. Evans, do you happen to know your husband's password for his laptop? This question seemed to bring Lisa out of her state of despair and occasional tears, as it appeared to be something she could help with. It used to be his name followed by his year of birth. Try Mark 1971, she suggested. Unfortunately, it soon became apparent that he had changed his password, as none of the old variations worked. It's okay, Mrs. Evans. We have computer experts in our forensic department who will find a way to bypass your husband's password. With any luck, it won't take long. 2 items were tagged and transferred to a van, and 2 forensic technicians left with Lisa Evans. Detective Nesbitt decided to revisit the topic of obtaining her preliminary statement. Well, Mrs. Evans, I need to get the basic facts about your whereabouts this weekend. Let's just cover Saturday morning until you returned home this afternoon. He took out a notepad and pen, ready to write down her description of how she spent the specified period of time. Lisa Evans took a deep breath and began, I was doing the usual household chores until noon on Saturday. Mark called me from Pittsburgh at about 1 o'clock or maybe 1:30. We only spoke for a few minutes. He said it was a pity that he couldn't be home for the weekend. After that, I went shopping until about 4:30 and then returned home around 7:30 p.m. I went to a friend's house and stayed with her for the night. I woke up late in the morning, not in a hurry, and as you know, I returned home around 2 o'clock. She seemed increasingly tense as her explanation continued, and by the time she finished, she was looking at the floor and rubbing her hands together. As he wrote the last words of her explanation into his notebook, Detective Nesbitt closed it and tapped it with his pen for a few seconds before saying, We may need more details, Mrs. Evans. This will do for a start, but be prepared to provide more details and exact time frames if circumstances require it. He put the notebook and pen back in his pocket before standing up. Detective Nesbitt was about to leave the house to join the others who were searching the garage and Lisa's car when he suddenly realized that he needed one more item. Oh, Mrs. Evans, do you have any recent full-length photographs of your husband? A good portrait would also be useful. We only have his photo from the driver's license database for now. Something less formal would be better for distribution to the patrol officers. With that, he walked over to the mantelpiece, where he looked at several wedding photographs until Lisa Evans quickly walked over to the bookshelf and selected a thick photo album. Here are some good recent photos, Detective. Take your pick, she said. She returned to the couch, and the detective sat next to her as she opened the album. The last page of the book had some very good photographs for his purposes. Perhaps the best one included Lisa standing to Mark's right while a tall, well-built blonde man stood next to him on his left. This one will do, the detective said, pointing to the group photo. We can crop you and this other guy out. After a few seconds, the detective selected another photo, a very good portrait of Mark Evans. These 2 photographs are more than sufficient for our needs. When Lisa removed the 2 photos from the album and handed them to the detective, he looked at them again and asked, Is that guy in the photo with you and your husband a relative of his? If he has a brother or a parent from whom a DNA sample can be taken, it may be helpful if they can't get anything useful from a razor or toothbrush. Lisa quickly responded, No, this is Blake Moore. He's been my husband's best friend since high school. My husband has no family living nearby. After thanking her for the photos, Detective Nesbitt went to join the others in the garage. He left Lisa sitting at the kitchen table, looking despondent and on the verge of tears. He began to think that he felt sorry for this woman and her situation. Her husband was missing and might have been involved in a serious shootout. The fact that she didn't know he was even in town made the detective wonder what exactly was going on. Detectives, along with 2 forensic experts, soon finished searching the garage and car. During a thorough inspection of Lisa's car, technicians noticed something potentially important and definitely suspicious. It was decided that the car would be towed back to the garage for a thorough inspection and testing. While the 2 technicians packed their equipment and prepared to leave, the detectives stepped aside to discuss their thoughts on the case. Detective Nesbitt, standing so that he could look back at the side door of the Evans house, said to his partner, What is your opinion of Mrs. Evans? I've had various thoughts about her, and this positive blood test on the pedals of her car really gives me pause. Well, you have an advantage since you talked to Mrs. Evans. I was only here for the search. She seemed like a typical uptight wife, but you know how that goes. Right now, I wouldn't want to bet on whether she's involved in something or if it's just what it seems. Nesbitt suddenly walked towards the side door, saying as he went, "Come with me, Dave. Let's see how she reacts when we tell her." The two detectives walked to the side door, knocked, and entered. Lisa Evans was talking on her cell phone and looked very surprised when the two men walked into the kitchen. She quickly turned off the phone without saying a word to her interlocutor. "You're back. I thought you were done here," she said. Detective Nesbitt stepped aside so that his partner could observe Lisa Evans equally. "We thought we were done here too." However, the technicians found what appeared to be marks on the gas and brake pedals in your car. "We're taking your car to the site for a thorough inspection. I hope you don't mind." The two detectives watched her closely as he continued, "That's a question we'll probably need an answer to. We have no way of knowing at this point if this is related to the incident at the park, but if it turns out to be a coincidence, we will still press for answers. Oh, and we'll need the shoes you wore today. I haven't been anywhere near the park. I haven't been there in weeks." "I don't understand," she said. As she spoke, she took off her shoes and handed them to Detective Nesbitt. When this was done, she fell into a chair, covered her face with her hands, and began to sob. The two detectives, realizing they couldn't say or do more without additional information, said goodbye to her, leaving her slumped in the kitchen chair. "What do you think, Dave? Is she what she seems to be, a wife distraught with worry about her husband, or maybe she's just a very good actress? Did you notice that she was on the phone when we came in and had disconnected the other person?" David Klein shook his head and said, "I just don't know, Pete. I just don't know. She seems sincere enough, but you know how it goes. If the evidence in his car turns out to be his, there's a good chance his wife is involved. We see this over and over again. Maybe we should do a few checks around them. Someone might know something relevant to this whole situation. And as for the phone conversation, maybe she was talking to her best friend. Women always turn to their best friend when something goes wrong. Yeah, I think you're right. A little old-fashioned digging might lead to something. What I'd really like to know is why he arrived in town 2 days earlier than expected. That could be the key to the whole case." When he reached his car, Detective Nesbitt took out a plastic evidence bag, placed a pair of shoes in it, and sealed the bag tightly. Since both partners had arrived separately, each drove back to the station alone. They tried to piece together a picture from the evidence they had. Unfortunately, neither of them had enough data to come to anything more definitive than what they had already discussed. Both were busy filling out reports and other paperwork for the rest of their shift. There was no new information from the lab before they went home, so they could only process what they had already learned that day. The next morning, both Peter and Dave arrived half an hour early. It was clear that the Mark Evans case was at the forefront of both of their minds. Fortunately, their dedication to work was rewarded when a stack of reports from the forensic lab and the medical examiner awaited them on the table. They took an hour to read the reports, passing them back and forth as they absorbed the information presented. When they finished reviewing what they had, they realized there were still many more reports to come. Looking at one particular report, Peter Nesbitt said to his partner, "This data certainly points in one direction, doesn't it? It looks like we can expect a few more reports this morning, so I don't think we should rush to conclusions. I'd rather not make hasty decisions." David Klein nodded and replied, "I think you're right. Let's wait until they get more data out of the computer. In the meantime, we can go talk to his lawyer and some of the people he worked with. I'm not sure we have enough to make an arrest yet. We'll need to take official statements before proceeding." The two detectives were in complete agreement and left around 9 a.m. for the office of attorney Mark Evans. Like everyone in the legal community, Robert Graham did not want to appear biased against the police, especially during the investigation. He quickly gave them a few minutes of his time. "I understand that I cannot discuss anything pertaining to my client's legal situation. Having said that, let's hear what you want from me so that I can decide whether to answer your questions or not," the lawyer said as he sat back in his chair and waited expectantly. Detective Nesbitt spoke quickly, not wanting to waste too much of the lawyer's precious time. "We have several email messages that we received under a warrant from Mark Evans' computer. Can you confirm receipt of them for us?" We just need to know that the messages were actually sent to you in the last couple of weeks. We want to be sure that these aren't just drafts." He handed 4 sheets of paper to the lawyer, who quickly scanned each one before replying. "These letters appear to be genuine. I can confirm receipt of them." He handed them back to the detective, who immediately stood up and said, "Thank you, Mr. Graham. That's all we need. We couldn't make investigative decisions based on these letters without confirming their authenticity." The 2 detectives left the office, exchanging smiles as they headed back to the car. Driving to ABC Industrial, Peter Nesbitt said to his partner, "As you mentioned yesterday, in these situations there is usually a spouse involved. We still have a few steps to go through." When they arrived at Mark Evans' workplace, they were quickly ushered into the office of his immediate superior. This time, it was Detective Klein who spoke. "We are investigating the discovery of a car in George Washington Park yesterday. You probably read about it in this morning's paper. The car belonged to one of your employees, Mark Evans. We have a few questions that you may be able to answer." Mark's boss quickly assured them that he would do everything he could to help. He said that Mark was considered a very valuable employee, and anything that could be done to solve this mystery was definitely acceptable. "First, I would like to know if Mark was expected to remain in Pittsburgh after Friday night. There are reports that he was scheduled to attend seminars throughout Saturday and Sunday. We need to know if that is the case." His boss quickly responded, "Mark was definitely not scheduled for the weekend. I fully expected him to be back Friday night." Detective Klein nodded, made a note on his notepad, and continued, "Have you noticed anything unusual in Mark's behavior lately? We want to see if there was something on his mind or something that caught his eye." The man at the desk thought for a moment and then replied, "Mark has actually seemed more stressed lately. A couple of weeks ago, I asked him if there was a problem. He said that everything was fine. I also noticed that he often seemed preoccupied. I just assumed he was working hard to solve our problems, but I guess he might have other things on his mind." The detectives thanked him and then quickly headed back to their car. The situation was becoming clearer, and both knew that by the end of the day they would likely have a major breakthrough in this matter. Late in the morning, they returned to the office to find that some preliminary DNA results had arrived. There was also a strange box with wires lying on the report from the forensic laboratory. The 2 detectives found it particularly interesting, especially when combined with some of the printed maps the computer technician had given them. With another empty space filled, the picture became clearer. The 2 men took their accumulated data, printouts, and notebooks with them as they went to spend a couple of hours in one of the empty interrogation rooms. By the time they left, they had a clear idea of what had happened in the park, although there were still large gaps. They agreed that it was time to visit Lisa Evans again. This time, they had enough information to ask her a few questions, tough questions. Depending on her answers, there could be a reason to bring her in for an official statement. The detectives arrived at the Evans home a little after 3 in the afternoon. They didn't call ahead to avoid giving her a chance to prepare for their arrival. They really wanted to take her by surprise. They walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell like regular visitors. Lisa Evans was clearly surprised to see 2 men on the doorstep. "Detectives, have you found my husband? I called dispatch every couple of hours, and they keep telling me there's no news." Detective Nesbitt responded, "No, we haven't found your husband yet, but we've made some progress. We'd like to come in and ask you a few questions, if that's okay." Lisa Evans seemed a little confused but then agreed. "Sure, come in. I'll do anything to help you find Mark." She walked into the living room with the 2 men following her. Sitting down on the sofa, each of the detectives took a chair opposite her. Detective Klein began the conversation by opening a notepad and asking, "Is there anything you want to tell us about your relationship with Blake Moore?" The detectives decided that such a direct question could be a way to unsettle Lisa Evans so that she would reveal something she would rather hide. The decision was immediately rewarded when Lisa Evans' face paled before she said, "What do you mean?" "My relationship with Blake? He's my husband's best friend. He always hangs out with Mark, but he's just my friend," Lisa said, her eyes darting back and forth between the 2 detectives. Detective Nesbitt then joined the conversation. "Are you or are you not having an affair with Blake Moore?" Detective Nesbitt asked calmly, waiting for her response. It seemed impossible, but both detectives later agreed that she became even paler after this question. Her mouth opened and closed several times without making a sound before she said, "Absolutely not. How can you come here and ask me such questions?" The two detectives immediately stood up, and Detective Klein said, "I think you'll need to come with us to the station. We'll take an official statement from you." Lisa was clearly starting to panic and said, "What, am I under arrest? Why should I go to the station with you? You are not under arrest yet. We have reason to believe that you have not been honest with us, and we want an official statement. You will be able to request a lawyer if you wish," Detective Nesbitt explained. Lisa looked desperately from one detective to another and quickly said, "I don't need a lawyer. I haven't done anything. If you want me to come to the station to answer your questions, then fine. I'll do it. I'll do anything to help you find my mark." Lisa Evans quickly stood up to accompany the two detectives to the car for the ride downtown. She walked ahead of them, so she didn't notice when Pete gave Dave a sign of approval. After helping her into the back seat, the two men took their seats in the front and silently drove back to the police station. Arriving at the station, the detectives walked slowly with Lisa Evans up the stairs to their office and then into one of the empty interrogation rooms. They chose the darkest room they could find that needed painting and could use some new furniture. They wanted to create the most negative atmosphere possible. "We'll leave you here for a few minutes while we get our paperwork. Are you sure you don't want to talk to a lawyer?" Detective Nesbitt offered. This time, she refused quickly, shaking her head. In these gloomy conditions, she still looked very composed, although her blue eyes were full of tears. She sat down heavily in one of the chairs as the detective walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. "Make sure both cameras are running the entire time we're with her. I want a good record of everything said. I have a feeling we're going to solve this case, and I don't want to miss a word of what she says," Detective Klein instructed, speaking with his superior, the person who would record and personally testify to what was said in the interview room. Only then did Peter Nesbitt approach with the files they had accumulated. He was thinking about his upcoming interview with Lisa Evans and said, "Let's get some coffee first. Let her worry a little." This was quickly agreed upon, and the three men spent the next 20 minutes in the staff room discussing the case and how they would conduct the interrogation. Life doesn't move in a straight line. Countless events occur simultaneously in different time frames. While the two detectives were speaking with Mark Evans' manager that morning, across town a volunteer answered a call at the Crime Stoppers office. "Good morning, this is your local Crime Stoppers office. We pay up to $1,000 cash for good tips on unsolved crimes. How can you help us fight crime? Please note that this call is being recorded." No one answered for a few seconds, and the volunteer manning the phone thought there was no one on the line. Just before she was about to hang up, the elderly male interlocutor said, "This is where I am. Can I get money if I help the police?" "Well, sir, it depends on what you tell us, what crime it's about, and how much the police think you helped solve it. Do you have information about the crime?" There was silence again for a few moments before the caller spoke. "So I won't get the money now? Should I wait? What if the cops want to trick me? Then what?" "Well, sir, we need to know for sure that you helped. The money doesn't come from the police, so they have no reason to deceive you. Why don't you tell me what you know, and I'll give you a code number to proceed with. You can call back in a few days, and I will tell you if the information helped and how much it costs." The man said, a little annoyed, "I want the money now. I need money now." "Well, sir, that's how it works. What do you mean when you say you need money? If you are homeless and need food, I can give you the addresses of several shelters that provide food. I don't need any damn food. I need money. You know the grape juice that sells for $5 a bottle?" The woman giggled to herself but told the man, "I'm afraid I can't help you with this right now. If your information is useful, you will probably be able to buy many of these bottles of grape juice." "Good, then I'll wait. What I saw was someone throwing away a weapon into the river. I was under the 3rd Street Bridge, minding my own business on a Sunday morning, or at least I think it was a Sunday morning, when this guy pulled into a public parking lot. When he came out, he was carrying a weapon and 2 shovels. He threw them all into the river right in front of me. I was scared, I'll tell you. I thought that he would definitely notice me and use the weapon on me, the caller said. The operator, intrigued, asked, was that in the parking lot on the east side of the 3rd Street Bridge? Did he throw them far into the water? Yes, exactly there, he confirmed. No, he just threw them off the end of the little pier that is there. These items shouldn't be hard to find. He paused before adding, I can describe him. He was large and had light-colored hair. Not blonde, just light. His car was dark blue, and the license plate started with ASC, but I forgot the rest. Jimmy brought some juice and shared it, so I forgot some of it, but the rest is true. I lived in Arizona and once owned a Chevrolet Impala SS, which is why I remembered. The woman wrote down all the information and was ready to end the call. Well, sir, I think I have everything I need. I'll give you a number to remember, number 127. Call back in a few days and mention tip number 127. I'll tell you if the information was useful to the police and how much it's worth, as well as where you can collect the money anonymously. The call ended quickly, and the Crime Stoppers operator relayed the information to the police contact. He suggested sending a diver soon, as removing weapons from the streets was a top priority for the mayor. A police diver arrived at the scene just over an hour later and quickly recovered 3 items thrown into the river. The appropriate reports were completed and submitted to Crime Stoppers. By 2:30 a.m., the shovels were with the property clerk, and the guns were taken to the forensic lab for further testing to determine if they matched any unsolved crimes in the city. Once the weapon was registered, it became clear that the caliber and type of ammunition still inside it matched perfectly with a recent crime scene in George Washington Park. A test bullet fired from the weapon was a perfect match with a bullet recovered from a log found in the park. The report was immediately sent upstairs to the attention of the detectives in charge of the case, and a technician was dispatched to retrieve the 2 shovels from the property clerk. As different chains of events can run in parallel, they can also intersect. That's exactly what happened when the detectives and their commander left the staff room and encountered a clerk delivering ballistics and Crime Stoppers reports. Detectives, I was just bringing you this information. We have obtained the weapons used in the George Washington Park shooting. The attached Crime Stoppers report also has some information that may lead you straight to the culprit, the forensic lab clerk said with a smile, handing 2 reports to the surprised detectives before returning to his department. Detectives Klein and Nesbitt reviewed the 2 reports and quickly sat side by side at a computer terminal to call up records from the Department of Vehicle Registration. Once finished, they discussed their plan. Pete, I suggest we split up. I'll start interrogating our guest in the interrogation room, and you can take a uniformed officer to visit Mr. Moore. We should bring him in for questioning too, Klein proposed. Sounds like a plan, Dave. Everything is going well, isn't it? Nesbitt replied. New lines of action were formed as Detective Klein took the accumulated reports and information to the interrogation room where Lisa Evans continued to wait. Meanwhile, his partner discussed with the commanding officer the request for a uniformed officer's assistance for a surprise visit to Blake Moore. When Detective Klein entered the interrogation room, Lisa Evans sat quietly at the table, her face showing neither sadness nor fear. She seemed calmly awaiting her fate, whatever it might be. Sorry to keep you waiting, Mrs. Evans. I'm ready to start. Please note that there are 2 video cameras in this room, and everything we say and do is recorded, Klein said. She looked at him with some surprise and said, I don't care if you record us. I have nothing to hide. Klein got down to business. Okay, let's begin. I'll start where we left off when we talked at your house. One more time, are you having an affair with Blake Moore? Yes or no? His direct approach had a noticeable effect on her. Her shoulders sagged a little, and she turned away, no longer meeting the detective's gaze. After a few seconds, she quietly said, yes. Detective Klein pulled a couple of pages from the stack in front of him. It's good that you decided to be honest. We have evidence of your affair here, printed from your husband's laptop. This revelation shocked her. She met his eyes again, asking, what do you mean? Do you have proof? Nobody knew about Blake and me, Lisa said, her voice trembling. Your husband certainly knew, Detective Klein replied, sliding a page across the table. Here is an email he sent to his lawyer almost a month ago, in which he mentions preparing divorce papers on grounds of infidelity. This is a map from 2 weeks ago, clearly showing the route you took that day with timestamps indicating you spent 2 hours at Blake Moore's house. And here's a copy of the email your husband sent his lawyer that day, telling him how you lied when he called and you said you were home. Sheets of paper were slid across the table one after another, each stopping in front of Lisa. She looked at the documents and then at the detective several times before picking each one up and confirming that they indeed showed what the detective said. Finally, she spoke. How could Mark do this? How could he know where I was? She picked up the detailed map and traced the route clearly marked on it, showing the path from her home to her lover's home. I don't know how your husband found out in the first place, but something made him install this device in your car, Klein said, holding up a small black device, smaller than a pack of cigarettes. It had PT-200 stamped on its side and Rocky Mountain tracking below. He bought this online along with an unlimited tracking option and could use his laptop to get a full real-time location history for you, with addresses and timestamps. He could know where your car was every minute of every day since he installed that underdash device. Lisa stared at the small, innocuous-looking electronic device as if it were a scorpion poised to strike. Are you saying Mark has known about us for weeks? Oh God, and he wanted a divorce, she said, beginning to cry again. The detective took the moment to return the documents and tracking device to a separate pile next to him. He definitely knew, along with the times and places of all 4 of your meetings with his friend over the last month, Klein continued. The last map was created just after midnight on Saturday night, the night he disappeared. It was around the same time that he sent an email to his lawyer saying he was going to confront you both at Moore's house. He told his lawyer he was worried he might be arrested if he broke into the house or got into a fight with your lover, his supposed friend. Lisa looked at the detective again and said, but he never came there. I spent the night there, but Mark never arrived. Something must have happened to him before he got to Blake's house. The detective was prepared for this. I'm sure something happened to him. Preliminary DNA results confirm that the evidence in the park is his, and we have recovered the weapon used. We can link the weapon to your lover. Now the question is, how long are you going to cover for Blake? Blake never did anything to Mark. I was with him the whole time, and he never left that night, Lisa said, her eyes leaving the detective as she continued. We were together all night in his bed. Detective Klein pulled a few more pages from his stack and said, we have additional evidence, including evidence found in your car and on your shoes. This evidence belongs to your husband. My partner is on his way to pick up Mr. Moore and will soon determine if his story matches yours. There's also the issue of prosecutorial discretion. Whichever of you two is the first to tell the truth about what really happened and where we can find your husband's body will receive the best offer in the trial. He handed the test reports to her, but she barely looked at them. Mark is not dead. He can't be dead. I love him. I need him, she said, starting to cry again. The detective took the reports and tracking device, placing them in a separate pile in front of him, and headed toward the door. I'll leave you for a few minutes so you can come to your senses. You're really not helping yourself by refusing to acknowledge your responsibility in this, Klein said before leaving. Detective Klein left a stack of evidence on his desk, shook his head as he passed his commanding officer, and headed to the break room for a fresh cup of coffee. His commander continued to periodically glance at the monitor displaying the interior of the interrogation room to ensure Lisa remained safe and secure. As he left the station, Detective Nesbitt was deep in thought about the Mark Evans case. It seemed they had gathered enough information from the forensics department to solve it soon. He also wondered if Blake Moore was still in town. If Moore had known how much evidence the police already had, he probably would have tried to escape. Detective Nesbitt arrived at Moore's house almost simultaneously with a patrol car providing him with backup. The two officers, familiar with each other, exchanged greetings as they headed to the front door. Nesbitt was almost surprised when their knocking quickly resulted in Blake Moore answering the door. The man looked curiously at the two strangers at his door, one clearly in a police uniform and the other holding an ID and badge. Yes, officers, how can I help? Detective Nesbitt quickly responded, I'm Detective Nesbitt, and I'm here about the disappearance of Mark Evans. We'd like you to come with us to the station. We have Mrs. Evans there now, and some questions have arisen that will require your input. Tall, strong, and notably attractive, the man asked, "Am I being arrested?" "I know Mark is missing because I spoke to his wife. I don't think I can be of much help. We have a few questions that we think you might be able to answer. If you don't mind, we'd like you to accompany us now, although you are not under arrest," Nesbitt explained. Blakemore seemed too stunned to resist their request and quickly joined them in the unmarked car driven by Detective Nesbitt. Once there, he calmly accepted their invitation to sit in the back seat and was not at all surprised when the detective and the uniformed officer took their places in the front seats. Department protocol required 2 officers to provide backup when dealing with a potentially risky situation. Detective Nesbitt first addressed his uniformed partner, "We'll send one of the patrol cars later to take you back to your vehicle." After handling this formality, Detective Nesbitt turned to Blakemore. "Tell me, Mr. Moore, how well do you know Mrs. Evans?" Their passenger responded quickly, "She's just Mark's wife to me. I've known her since he met her." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious, sir." "What do you do for a living, Mr. Moore?" Blakemore seemed to relax a bit at this question and answered, "I own a small landscaping company, Moore's Landscaping. We work a lot with commercial properties. You've probably seen some of our work, as we've even done work for the city." Their conversation continued until they arrived at the police station, where Blakemore was taken to an interrogation room next to the one where Lisa Evans was being held. He was asked to wait alone while Detective Nesbitt collected documents that had been placed on his desk shortly before by Detective Klein. A few minutes later, a conversation began between Blakemore and Detective Nesbitt that mirrored the recently concluded interrogation of Lisa Evans. Blake initially denied having an affair with Lisa Evans, but emails and tracking reports quickly caused him to change his story. He soon admitted to an affair lasting almost 4 months but vehemently denied any involvement in Mark Evans's disappearance. He insisted neither he nor Lisa left his house the night Lisa's husband went missing. As Detective Nesbitt continued to question him, a new theory about what happened in the park emerged. "I had nothing to do with what happened in that park. If Mark found out about Lisa and me, he would probably have gone ballistic, and there's no telling what he might have done. He might have even hired someone to frame Lisa and me. He and I had issues because of my attitude towards Lisa." "What do you mean, Mr. Moore?" Detective Nesbitt asked. "We have the weapon that was used. A witness described you in your car and stated that you were responsible for throwing the weapon into the river. He even gave us most of your license plate number. Don't try to tell us that Mark Evans staged an elaborate setup to frame you and his wife." Blakemore grew very agitated. "You don't know Mark. We've been best friends since elementary school. But I've known for years it's better not to be seen with his girlfriends or, now, his wife. Back in high school, I dated one of his girlfriends behind his back. When he found out that I slept with her while they were dating, he was so angry he scared me. I'm much bigger and stronger, but he frightened me. He warned me that he would not tolerate it and that I would be a dead man." Detective Nesbitt listened with mild amusement. "Are you saying that you were genuinely afraid of what he would do if he found out, but you still dated his wife? This doesn't make sense." Blake calmed a bit as he said, "It's stupid, isn't it? I just couldn't resist her. The attraction between us had been building up for years, and I finally took a serious step a few months ago. We've met periodically since then. I have no idea how he found out, we were so careful." Detective Nesbitt reviewed his reports before continuing. "Yeah, it was foolish. Sometimes I think half of our murders and suicides are due to such stupidity, this eternal triangle. In this case, the only thing that's clear is that you and Lisa are the prime suspects. You can also tell us what happened. Did Mark catch you by surprise, and the situation got out of control? Or was this planned from the start so you wouldn't have to worry about him finding out? I don't buy the idea that he arranged his own death, it's too bizarre. He had already negotiated a divorce with his lawyer, so why would he suddenly resort to this? I don't know what happened. I just know that Lisa and I had nothing to do with it. As for being together, that wasn't the plan. We both knew it was just a fling and it wouldn't last much longer. We had already begun to lose interest in each other." Detective Nesbitt leaned forward and said, "We have probable cause to search your home, car, and office. I wouldn't be surprised if that's already happening." You'd better tell the truth before we put the final nail in your coffin. I'll offer you the same deal that I'm sure your lover has already received from my partner. Be the first to tell what happened and get a reduced sentence. There's no point in both of you staying silent and risking the maximum penalty. Use your head and do yourself a favor. Blakemore was outraged. I had nothing to do with what happened to Mark. Maybe Lisa arranged something herself, but if so, I don't know anything about it. Detective Nesbitt collected his papers without responding to Blake's latest theory. As he left the room, he said, "That's what happens when we have two people involved in a crime. One always tries to pin the blame on the other. You can relax for now because I don't think you'll be going anywhere anytime soon." After leaving the interview room, Detective Nesbitt found his partner waiting with another report. Everything is getting clearer. 2 shovels found in the river are labeled as belonging to Moore's Landscaping. What a fool. Why do these people always think we won't figure out what happened? A few minutes later, 2 detectives explained the evidence they had collected to the district attorney. Even though they didn't have a body and the evidence was circumstantial, it didn't take long to convince him that there was enough to press charges. Half an hour later, Lisa Evans and Blakemore were formally charged with the murder of Mark Evans. Both loudly protested their innocence as their Miranda rights were read, but they were told the case was now in the hands of prosecutors and the court system. Neither of them found comfort in this information. After the charges were filed, Lisa and Blake were taken to the ground floor of the police station to be fingerprinted and photographed. The instruction not to smile for the photos was unnecessary, as Blake always had an angry expression and Lisa was unable to smile and cry simultaneously. Once returned to adjacent cells, they had their first opportunity to speak to each other since the charges were laid. "What are we going to do, Blake? They can't believe we did something to Mark, can they?" Lisa asked, still sobbing intermittently. "We need to find lawyers. I think unless you want to share a lawyer with me, it might be cheaper, and since we're being accused of the same thing, it makes sense. This whole situation is completely wrong. I'm sure Mark arranged it for us. I think the man might have paid someone to kill him and then left a trail so the cops would blame us." Mark was clearly still very angry. "Do you really think he would go to such extreme measures to kill himself?" Lisa replied, outraged. "I don't think you knew your husband as well as you thought you did. I'm completely surprised he didn't do something drastic the day he found out about us. This is a real mystery to me. I've known Mark for years and didn't think he'd just let it go. If I had thought for even a second that he would find out about us, I would never have been with you." Lisa continued, "I don't believe Mark is capable of something like that. I don't know how or when he found out. I never noticed him treating me differently. He was out of town most of the times we met, and we were never together in public. The few times we did meet while he was in town were at a little motel on the north side. I shouldn't have betrayed him. Even if he's not dead, he'll still want a divorce," Lisa said, her voice breaking several times as she began to worry again. Blake managed a few sobs before saying, "Damn it, Lisa. Give it a rest. You should have realized how this would end if he caught us. Your eyes were wide open the first time you came to my house and found yourself in my bed." His words had the desired effect, and she stopped sobbing. After a few seconds, she quietly said, "You're right. I can only hope that he will forgive me." They were both silent for a few minutes before Lisa suggested, "I could call Robert Graham. He might agree to represent us both if we split the costs." They agreed to this proposal on legal grounds, and after a few minutes, when Lisa managed to attract the attention of a passing officer, she was taken to a small room intended for making calls, where there was a telephone and a phone book. Her call to Robert Graham did not go as smoothly as she had hoped. He informed her that, as Mark's divorce lawyer, he could not represent her. Instead, he suggested one of his colleagues, Basil Smith, a lawyer with extensive experience in criminal matters, take on their case. She quickly agreed, and it was arranged that their new lawyer would arrive immediately to discuss the case. Blake was relieved to hear that the lawyer was on the way and thanked Lisa for making the call. They both returned to the wooden benches bolted to the back wall of their cells and spent the next hour lost in their thoughts as they waited. When Basil Smith arrived, they were both ushered into a small room reserved for lawyer-client meetings. Basil Smith was the epitome of a seasoned lawyer, short, stocky, with thin dark hair framing the bald spot on his head. At least he avoided the dreadful comb-over, and a dark blue striped suit completed the professional look. At around 50 years old, he introduced himself quickly, and the two nervous clients waited while he reviewed the copies of the indictment documents handed to him upon arrival. After studying the documents, he raised his head and said, "So you are both accused of the murder of Mark Evans. What can you tell me about what the arresting officers informed you?" "Mrs. Evans, you're first. Please, give me a brief overview of what happened." Lisa summarized the events since Detective Nesbitt had met her in the yard on Sunday afternoon. By the time she spoke about fingerprinting and photographs, she was crying again. Through her sobs, she concluded, "I had nothing to do with what happened in the park. I love Mark. I couldn't hurt him." Basil Smith absorbed her words for a moment before turning to Blake. "Now it's your turn. Please provide your account without unnecessary details." Blake more quickly outlined what happened from the moment officers arrived at his home that afternoon. He wasn't emotional as he told the story and concluded, "Lisa and I had nothing to do with Mark's disappearance or what happened in the park. I told Lisa and the police the same thing, and now I'm telling you. Mark Evans set this up. I believe he paid for his own death, and part of the deal was to blame us." He looked at the lawyer intently, as if daring him to disagree. Blake's insistence that Mark was dead brought tears to Lisa's eyes again. Their lawyer glanced at her briefly and said, "Now is not the time to convince each other. Your first priority will be addressing your bail. Based on what you've told me in these charging documents, I expect bail to be around $100,000 for each of you. Will there be any issues with that?" Lisa looked stunned and asked, "Do I need $100,000 for bail?" She was on the verge of panic, knowing she didn't have such funds. "No, Lisa. You only need 10% or $10,000 in cash to cover the $100,000 deposit. In this state, full bail is not required unless the judge orders otherwise," the lawyer quickly explained. With this explanation, neither of them faced difficulty in obtaining bail, and naturally, they wondered if they could be released immediately. "Tomorrow morning you will be charged, and bail will be set. Then you can complete the necessary paperwork to be released. You'll spend the night here, so accept it," the lawyer said. Both clients reacted negatively to this statement, but their lawyer said there was nothing he could do until they were formally charged. Once the task of securing their release was completed, he would speak with the district attorney to obtain disclosure of the evidence. He would better understand their situation when he knew what evidence they were facing. They were returned to their cells, where they had little rest. They received greasy takeout for dinner, one blanket for the night, and noisy cellmates. They did not look particularly fresh the next morning when they met with their lawyer at 10 a.m., shortly before their first court appearance. None of the court personnel, not even the judge, cared about their appearance when accepting their pleas of innocence and setting bail at the expected $100,000. Because Blake had both his home and business as assets, he was able to quickly post $10,000 bail and was released by early afternoon. Lisa, however, was not as fortunate. Unlike Blake, she did not have exclusive ownership of the house, so that option was eliminated. She was shocked to discover that her savings account, which she had expected to contain more than $20,000, was empty. Without these funds, she was unable to raise the necessary amount and ended up calling her parents in desperation. Explaining the need for bail to her parents turned out to be one of the most difficult tasks of her life. After much persuasion, they finally agreed to cover her $10,000 shortfall. By the time Lisa enlisted her parents' help, it was too late to complete the paperwork, and she spent a second night in the cell, this time with two other inmates who were slightly high and easily accessible. She spent most of the night huddled in a corner under her only blanket. By noon the next day, with all the financial paperwork completed, she was finally allowed to leave the station and return to the empty house. She immediately took a shower, went to bed, and ignored several calls, letting the answering machine handle them. The following month passed rather quickly for the two defendants. Within the first few days, Lisa learned that the money withdrawn from her joint account with her husband had been taken by him approximately 10 days before his disappearance. Her lawyer discovered a letter sent to his partner, Robert Graham, in which Mark explained that he was withdrawing funds from the account in cash to prevent his wife from claiming his legal share when she received divorce papers. The letter did not specify what he did with the cash, although it mentioned that he would return her share after reaching an appropriate agreement with Lisa under the terms of the divorce. Lisa and Blake met several times with Basil Smith, who informed them that he had met with the district attorney, received copies of various reports and summaries of evidence, and planned to meet with the district attorney again in the hope that all charges would be dropped. He felt that the absence of a body or a witness to question would make it impossible to convict them. Shortly after their release on bail, he suggested hiring a private investigator to try to prove that Mark had somehow contributed to his own death or disappearance. Blake was pleased with this suggestion, although Lisa still didn't believe Mark would go to such extremes. She developed a theory that Mark was the victim of a botched carjacking, saying it was no less plausible than Blake's theory. Despite her hijacking theory, she still struggled to accept that everything pointed to Mark no longer being alive. Over the next few weeks, they received regular reports from the hired detective, but they all indicated the same outcome: nothing was found. Basil Smith also suggested that the detective try to locate the informant who reported the disposal of weapons and shovels. Basil obtained a copy of the call recording from Crime Stoppers, and the detective used it to canvass areas where homeless people commonly lived. No one recognized the voice, and it seemed odd that the informant never followed up to see if the tip had led to any leads. It was necessary to consider the possibility that the caller had simply forgotten the number or even forgotten that they had called. The homeless population was also highly mobile, moving from one area to another based on factors such as weather, police presence, and the availability of quick income sources. Although he did not mention it, Basil Smith began to notice that his two clients were no longer getting along with each other. Neither volunteered any information, but shortly after their release on bail, Blake suggested to Lisa that now that Mark was out of the picture, they could meet as much as they wanted at either of their homes. Her response was swift and categorical: "I want nothing to do with you except for our business." You persisted, and like a fool, I gave in. Now I've lost Mark. Her response ended with another bout of tears, which seemed to occur frequently for almost no reason. Blake's reply was terse and final: "Do as you please, Lisa. You're not the only woman in town." Since then, they had not spoken to each other except in the presence of their lawyer, where a confrontation could harm both of them. The flames of their forbidden relationship had cooled. A little over a month later, Basil Smith arranged a meeting with District Attorney Jeff Bugden that they could all attend. Lisa and Blake entered the meeting hoping for the charges to be dropped. They were constantly pestered by prank calls and asked by friends and acquaintances about the nature of their relationship. Both began checking calls using caller ID and an answering machine. Dropping the charges would allow them to return to normal life. Lisa and Blake were surprised by how young, stylish, and informal Jeff Bugden looked. He could have been their lawyer's son, except he had a full head of hair. The prosecutor began as soon as all four were seated. "I'm glad we could meet today. I have received the final reports from the medical examiner and the police, and the forensic reports are now complete. After carefully reviewing all the evidence, I believe the best service to the public would be to offer you a reduced sentence of 8 to 12 years in exchange for a guilty plea to second-degree murder." The shock and horror on the faces of the accused, and to some extent on the face of their lawyer, was evident. Lisa and Blake protested loudly, declaring their innocence while their lawyer tried to calm them down and question the prosecutor about how he could justify such a proposal. As the others on the other side of the table calmed down, Jeff Bugden continued, "Since the initial charges were filed, I have received new reports and information. I will immediately forward copies of this new information to Mr. Smith. The first is a DNA report on evidence samples taken from the back of the license plate and the rubber trunk seal of your car, Mr. Moore. Both samples contain DNA from Mark Evans. The samples were taken under a search warrant prior to your release on bail. Additionally, a piece of black polyethylene found under the rear wheel of Mark Evans' car matches the brand and style used in your landscaping business." The prosecutor paused at this point, choosing to observe the defendant's reactions. Lisa looked more frustrated than shocked, while Blake was still processing the implications of the facts presented by the prosecutor. Lisa suddenly asked, "Blake, what did you do?" She seemed ready to continue her accusations, but Basil Smith immediately insisted on her silence. Blake exploded at her accusation, saying, "You know I had nothing to do with this. You were with me in my bed when it happened." That was all he had time to say before Basil grabbed him by the arm and told him to be quiet in no uncertain terms. The lawyer's next words were directed at the prosecutor. "Please excuse my clients, Jeff. We came here hoping the charges would be dropped, and your announcement took them by surprise." The prosecutor stood up, pulled a folder of reports from his briefcase, handed them to Basil Smith, and quickly left the room. As the door closed behind the departing prosecutor, Lisa and Blake began talking to the lawyer again. At the same time, he couldn't make out what they were both saying and had to order them to be quiet. Hearing their own lawyer tell them to be quiet, they were so shocked that they complied. "I know you are both shocked and upset by this turn of events. I didn't expect this either. There's no point in arguing with each other over this situation. We need to figure out how we're going to handle this without both of you ending up in jail. I understand that you both want to refuse his offer of 8 to 20 years in prison," Basil Smith said. Both clients quickly and firmly rejected the deal as proposed. They both believed that it would be impossible to convict them at trial. When it was decided that he would refuse the offer on their behalf, Basil Smith dismissed them, saying that he would have a lot of work to do preparing for the trial. When his two clients left, Basil was left alone in the room and quickly scanned the new reports, wondering if his clients were telling the truth. Technically, it didn't matter. He protected them regardless of their state of mind. He just liked being confident in what his clients were saying. Several months passed, and the trial of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore was about to begin. At 10 a.m. on Monday, as everyone in the courtroom stood, Judge Robert Cox took his seat. The defense table was arranged so that Basil Smith sat between his two clients. He decided this was the best way to manage the fact that they could barely be polite to each other. He considered suggesting that they each hire their own lawyer to keep them separate, but realized they probably wouldn't be able to afford separate legal representation. He knew that Blake Moore's business was in decline and that Lisa Evans had recently quit her job due to the stress of the pending trial and difficulty communicating with her estranged husband's friends and acquaintances. District Attorney Jeff Bugden made his first significant statement, addressing the jury directly. "Dear jurors, I will tell you the truth right away. We don't have the body of the victim in this case, Mark Evans. However, we intend to show you that he is dead and that the two accused are undoubtedly guilty of his murder." He began slowly, saying that the two accused began an affair several months ago. At some point, Mark Evans learned of the situation and began divorce proceedings against his unfaithful wife. Some details remain unknown, such as how and when exactly Mark Evans became suspicious. He described how traces found on Mark Evans' computer would prove he knew when and where the two accused met. Emails will be presented documenting his progress in tracking down the two defendants, preparing his finances for the divorce, and finally a message showing his intent to confront the two defendants. The prosecutor continued, "We cannot show exactly when the three participants in this triangle physically met, but we know the results and can show you through photographs and investigative reports what happened. We believe that a meeting took place between the three of them, probably at Mr. Moore's house, and during that meeting, Mr. Evans was neutralized. He was then driven, seated in the passenger seat and apparently unconscious, to a remote part of George Washington Park, less than half a mile from Mr. Moore's home. At this point, Lisa Evans lost her composure. It was only after several warnings from Judge Cox that the lawyer was finally able to calm his client down so the prosecutor could continue his plea. Through precise investigative techniques and forensic tests, it can be proven that both defendants were present at the scene of the crime. The defense will argue that the two individuals in question were not at the scene of this crime. Their strategy will be to use their own testimonies to assert that each was with the other at the time of the incident and therefore could not have been involved. This testimony is intriguing, but it should not, I am sure, distract the jury from returning a guilty verdict. This was a challenging statement for Basil Smith to counter. He emphasized that the accused are presumed innocent until proven guilty and that such evidence might be insufficient in a circumstantial case. He urged the jurors to disregard the prosecutor's opening statement and instead focus on the evidence presented during the trial. It was a bold effort, but several experienced court reporters from local newspapers gave the district attorney the upper hand in the first round. The first witness was a computer expert from the department who detailed finding emails and maps illustrating the route Mrs. Evans took when meeting her lover. The method Mark Evans used was described in one of his emails to a lawyer, and the computer expert explained to the jury how a small electronic device tracked the defendant's car, enabling her husband to create an accurate map with times and locations on his computer, showing where and when she met her lover. One reporter meticulously noted the company name, Rocky Mountain Tracking, for his article, confident that others might test the company's product based on Mr. Evans' successful use of it. During this testimony, Blakemore appeared slightly disinterested, while Lisa Evans looked very embarrassed and avoided eye contact with the jury. There was no point in cross-examining this witness for Basil Smith. The tracking device's data was what it was, and the emails could be quickly verified by his own law firm partner, Robert Graham. After a long lunch break, the trial resumed in the afternoon with testimony from the 911 operator and 2 patrol officers who responded to the initial call. They established the basic facts regarding the discovery of Mark Evans' car, and their testimony was relatively uneventful. The situation became more intense when detectives involved in the crime scene began their testimony, following a report from the patrol officers. The description of the scene provided by the district attorney was now given by forensic scientists and medical examiners present at the scene. When it was revealed that the victim was found in a state of dying, Lisa Evans lost her composure again. She screamed, "No, Mark can't be dead," and burst into tears. When it became clear that she would not calm down, the judge called for a break, and the court session was adjourned until 10 a.m. the following day. The second day of the trial began as the first had, at exactly 10 a.m. The medical examiner returned to the witness stand but provided little new information, mostly expanding on the tests performed on blood samples. After 15 minutes, District Attorney Jeff Bugden finished questioning him, and the witness was handed over to the defense attorney. As Basil Smith stood up and moved toward the witness stand, he quickly checked to ensure his client, Lisa Evans, was in control and not about to disrupt the court again as she had the day before. He knew she had been prescribed a sedative but was still concerned she might interfere with the cross-examination. He was relieved to see her sitting quietly in her seat for the moment. The next witness was a forensic expert specializing in weapons and ammunition. He testified about the bullets recovered, one from a car seat and one from a piece of wood. He stated that the ammunition was of the full metal jacket type, commonly used for target shooting and standard for military applications. The bullet removed from the seat had hit the metal support and was badly deformed, while the one from the wood was in very good condition. Combining this with the weapon recovered from the river was straightforward. The parade of witnesses from the crime lab and police detectives continued throughout the morning and part of the afternoon session. Basil Smith's only significant cross-examination came when a technician described the recovery of evidence samples from Blakemore's car. The technician testified that evidence was found behind the license plate and a stain on the foam seal of the trunk. The question quickly followed, could this evidence have been tampered with by a third party? The technician admitted that it was possible, and Basil Smith returned to the defense table with a smile on his face. The situation indicated that the latest techniques might have complications. Evidence was found inside her car, and further analysis showed that the foundation at the bottom of her right side made it difficult to argue that this was a setup. The expert then admitted that it was impossible to determine the exact conditions, and he clarified the situation before transferring the evidence. The defense attorney hoped that the slight doubt created by this apparent confession would lead the jury to discount the evidence against Lisa Evans. As the line of prosecution witnesses drew to a close, the conclusion of the last witness's testimony marked the end of the day's court hearing. Consequently, the third day began with an opportunity for the defense to present its evidence. Local newspapers continued to publish stories in the evening, featuring juicy stories about previous trials involving lovers and exciting courtroom rumors. Several serious articles about the trial suggested that it would be very challenging for the defense to counter the overwhelming amount of incriminating evidence presented by the prosecution. They also indicated that the absence of a body could complicate reaching a verdict, especially with the defense's anticipated strategy of questioning whether Mark Evans was truly dead. From several instances of cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, it was clear that this was Basil Smith's intention. Smith called a recognized evidence expert as his first defense witness. His name was Dr. Wilbur, known for providing expert testimony in many trials. He was quickly asked about his opinion on the medical examiner's testimony regarding the evidence in this case. Dr. Wilbur put on his glasses and looked at his small notebook. He responded that the evidence collection could have been handled more effectively and that a more accurate estimate of the total quantity at the scene could have been made if soil samples had been properly analyzed. The lawyer continued, based on your review of the evidence collected, do you have an opinion about the actual quantities at the scene? Dr. Wilbur stated that it was quite possible that just 1.5 pints of blood could have created the scene as recorded. The final question was whether the person who lost the blood shown in the photographs could have survived. Dr. Wilbur's one-word answer was yes. There was no cross-examination by the district attorney, and when Dr. Wilbur was dismissed, Basil Smith moved on to Blake Moore's testimony. Blake calmly and directly stated that he was not guilty of the murder of Mark Evans and believed that Mark himself had orchestrated his own murder. He also testified that he had never owned a gun and that the shovels found in the river could easily have been stolen from one of his company's work sites. Basil Smith aimed to keep the testimony straightforward and quickly handed his first witness over to the prosecutor for cross-examination. Jeff Bugden's first question was why Blake Moore thought Mark Evans would arrange his own murder. Blake Moore recounted Mark's reaction in high school when Blake started dating Mark's girlfriend behind his back, describing how Mark had threatened him and showing his propensity for violence. The prosecutor considered this for a moment and then asked, "So Mr. Moore, isn't it true that this isn't the first time you have been involved in an illicit relationship with a woman who Mark Evans would consider off-limits to his best friend? Don't you think that if Mark were going to kill someone, he would choose you?" Blake Moore hesitated to answer directly and began to emphasize his physical advantage over Mark, suggesting it would deter Mark from attacking him. "So you believe you could physically intimidate your best friend to the point of him committing suicide by someone else's hands?" the prosecutor asked. "Does that make you comfortable about pursuing his wife? Are your actions those of a supposed best friend?" Blake was told he did not need to answer the questions, but the prosecutor's statements had already painted Blake in a negative light. Basil Smith objected on the grounds that the district attorney was testifying rather than asking questions, and the judge agreed, instructing the jury to disregard the prosecution's last statement. However, even this warning did not fully counteract the impact of the district attorney's comments. Blake was clearly upset by his treatment but left the stand without further comment. Basil Smith knew his witness's testimony had not gone as planned but hoped that Lisa Evans's testimony would turn things around. Blake's testimony and the prosecutor's unanswered questions had cast him in a very poor light with the jury, and Smith hoped this would not affect their view of Lisa. Lisa Evans seemed to have her emotions well under control as she took the witness stand the next morning. Her lawyer asked her similar questions to those asked of Blake. She categorically stated that she did not participate in the attack on her husband and explicitly affirmed her love for him, saying she would never take part in any action to cause him physical harm. When asked to propose a theory about what might have happened, she suggested that the evidence might have been stolen. Basil Smith decided not to question his witness further. When the prosecutor began questioning Lisa, he started by asking, "Can you explain where you were from midnight Saturday, the time of your husband's last electronic transmission, until 2 p.m. on Sunday?" Lisa was embarrassed by the question and replied, "I told Mr. Smith where I was. I was at Blake Moore's house from 8 p.m. on Saturday until about 1:30 p.m. on Sunday." The prosecutor pressed, "You didn't quite answer the question. Could you provide a timeline of your activities from midnight Saturday until you returned home on Sunday?" Lisa looked confused and discouraged, finally stating, "Well, at midnight I was in Blake's bedroom." She was compelled to complete her sentence as the prosecutor gestured for her to continue. "How long did it last?" the prosecutor asked. "Let me put it this way," he said, waiting for a response. "Well, we finally fell asleep around 1 a.m., maybe a little after," Lisa answered, clearly uncomfortable. "So from midnight until about 1 a.m. you had a night and then fell asleep. What happened next? Please continue with your timeline." Lisa continued, "Well, we slept until about 4 to 6 o'clock. I remember getting up to go to the bathroom." The prosecutor asked, "Was Mr. Moore in bed when you woke up?" "Yes, he was there. We, had an intimate again and went back to bed around 6:30, then got up around 11 a.m., she said, speaking faster as she clearly wanted to finish. The prosecutor asked, "So when you returned from the bathroom, Mr. Moore initiated intimate with you, and this continued until about 6:30 a.m., at which point you fell back to sleep. Is that correct?" Lisa, very embarrassed, said, "No, that's not entirely true. He was not awake when I returned to bed. I woke him up. The prosecutor, surprised by this, asked, "You woke him up? How did you do that? Did you shake him by the shoulder to see if he wanted to have a night?" Lisa, clearly embarrassed, responded, "No, I didn't wake him up like that." She seemed to struggle with the words, and the prosecutor continued this line of questioning, which clearly upset the jury, especially the four women. "Please tell us how you woke him up if you didn't shake him by the shoulder and Intim didn't wake him up," the prosecutor persisted. Lisa seemed resigned, especially after her lawyer's objections were overruled by Judge Cox. Jeff Bugden, ready for the final blow, said, "You told your lawyer earlier that you loved your husband. Is that true?" He expected an emphatic yes from Lisa, accompanied by a nod. He continued, "I'm a bit confused. You say you love your husband, but you've just described spending the night he died in his best friend's bed, initiating night, and acting as if you don't care about him. How can we believe you weren't involved in his murder?" The prosecutor waited, but Lisa remained silent, crying quietly and covering her face with her hands. Judge Cox eventually ended her distress by asking if there were any more questions for the defendant or any repeated questions from the defense. When both sides said no, the judge announced that the trial would adjourn for lunch. The courtroom was nearly empty when Lisa, having regained some composure, left the witness stand to join her lawyer and co-defendant. They went to a somber dinner where an experienced lawyer warned them that the case could now go either way. He privately felt more pessimistic, noting that both of his clients had struggled on the witness stand. The afternoon court session ended quickly when Basil Smith announced that the defense had no more witnesses. Both lawyers prepared their closing statements, which presented no surprises. The prosecutor emphasized the overwhelming evidence against the defendant, while the defense highlighted the circumstantial nature of the case, the absence of a body, the possibility that Mark was still alive, and the lack of a concrete motive for his murder. The case was presented to the jury by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They deliberated for 2 hours before retiring for the night. The next morning, Lisa and Blake joined Basil Smith in his office, awaiting the call that the jury would return with a verdict. While his two clients waited in one of the conference rooms, Basil Smith was occupied with other matters. He warned them that it might take some time before they heard from the court, and he was correct. As they were forced to share the conference room, Lisa and Blake put their differences aside and discussed their chances of acquittal. Both remained hopeful and could not accept that the jury would believe they were capable of murder. Finally, at 3:30 p.m., the call came in. The jury had reached a verdict. Lisa's parents had come to town for the trial, though they had not been present in court during her testimony. Lisa was extremely grateful for their presence, as it meant they had not heard her testimony. They were in constant contact with the court throughout the day and were informed when the verdict arrived. Lisa appreciated their support as she sat at the defense table next to her lawyer. The reading of the verdict was swift. Lisa and Blake were found guilty of second-degree murder. Neither could believe it. Lisa burst into tears once again, while Blake slammed his fist on the table in exasperation. Just a few minutes later, they were handcuffed and handed over to the custody of the deputies. Lisa had only a few minutes to talk to her parents and declare her innocence. Like supportive parents, they joined in her grief before the convicted individuals were led to their cells. They were informed that they would return in a week for sentencing. It was a grim end to a challenging day. The week between the verdict and sentencing passed quickly. During this time, Lisa's parents visited her daily, while Blake received a single visit from a cousin. Blake's parents had passed away, and he was an only child. The week felt interminable for him as he came to realize how slowly time could drag in custody. He also began to see how bleak his future looked. Lisa remained in denial and refused to discuss the future when her parents brought it up. Fortunately, the sentencing process was brief. Both Lisa and Blake were given sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison. Basil Smith expressed his sympathy for their situation and said he would review the court records in search of a path to appeal. Once the sentencing was completed, things moved rapidly. Within 3 days, the two convicts were transferred from the local detention center to state prison. Lisa was sent to a women's prison with a reasonably good reputation, but the same could not be said for the facility where Blake was sent, which had experienced several riots in recent years. With the trial and sentencing over, local media no longer covered the case. Recent reports showed scenes of prisoners being transported on a converted school bus to a state prison. These reports may have used archival footage to describe the destinations of the convicted criminals. New disasters and crimes quickly took over the news, making it seem as if Lisa Evans and Blake Moore had vanished from the public eye. About 2 months after the verdict, Basil Smith met Jeff Bagden for a drink as a new case brought them together again. The Evans murder case still haunted Basil Smith occasionally. He told Jeff, "You really went after them." To be honest, I was surprised when the guilty verdicts came out. I concluded they were likely innocent, as they never deviated from their stories. Jeff pondered over his brandy and replied, 12 of their peers didn't believe their explanation. I try not to take these cases personally, although it's almost impossible when the crimes are so horrific. This case wasn't the worst I've ever tried, but it wasn't one I could feel much sympathy for. Basil Smith considered Jeff's statement and said, "I think you're right, but it still bothers me." About a year later, a small news story reported a major disturbance at the men's prison. One name stood out as Basil Smith read the article, Blake Moore. During the riot, Blake was shot and transferred to a hospital for treatment. The article noted that he was under guard but would survive. It had been almost 18 months since Lisa Evans and Blake Moore were sentenced for the murder of Mark Evans. Enough time had passed that even Basil Smith rarely remembered the case that had troubled him during his first year of representing defendants. He carefully reviewed the transcripts several times in his spare time but found no legal grounds for an appeal. There were no legal errors that could be exploited in favor of the convicted individuals. It was a relatively quiet Wednesday morning at the Innocence Project's New York City offices. The secretary had just returned from her morning coffee break and decided to check her appearance in a small mirror when a FedEx courier approached her desk with a package. It was one of those large padded envelopes commonly used for inter-office delivery of important information and products that businesses rely on, and it was overdue. The secretary signed the electronic panel presented to her and then watched as a young man in a summer uniform, a shirt and shorts, left the office. The exact nature of her thoughts was known only to her, but the mischievous smile on her face might have given a clue to anyone observing the scene. In this case, the only person in the reception area was an attractive young woman sitting at the secretary's desk. The package was simply addressed to the office, so she opened it to determine its contents. Inside, she found a DVD, a sealed black plastic bag, and a multi-page letter. Since she had no urgent tasks at the moment, she began to read the letter. It took her several minutes to finish, and the range of emotions crossing her face would have intrigued any observer. No one had entered the office since the FedEx delivery man left, so her expressive reactions went unnoticed. Once she finished reading, she thought for a moment before picking up the phone and pressing an intercom button. After waiting a few seconds, she said, "Tony, could you come here for a minute? We just received a package that I think you might be interested in." She listened for almost 15 seconds before continuing, "Yes, it does seem like something you could work on. This concerns 2 murder convictions that should obviously be overturned." About a minute later, a tall, red-haired young man wearing a white shirt and a pair of worn jeans emerged from one of the offices overlooking the reception area. He thanked her, took the package, and disappeared back through the door from which he had come. This young man was Tony Kelly, a recent law school graduate who had decided to spend some time working for the public good before pursuing a high-paying position at a Wall Street firm. He had been working at the Innocence Project for almost a year, focusing mostly on basic legal research for the more experienced lawyers who had started the office a few years ago. Although he knew he wouldn't stay there for his entire career, he enjoyed making a difference in the lives of those wrongfully convicted of serious crimes. Returning to the comfortable swivel chair behind his relatively inexpensive laminated desk, Tony placed the contents of the FedEx envelope on his desk and picked up the letter. After a brief glance at the DVD and sealed package, he turned his chair so he could lean back and rest his feet on the corner of the table while he read the letter. The letter was clearly printed in an easy-to-read font, and Tony quickly became absorbed in its contents. The letter began, "The Innocence Project, New York City, murder convictions for Lisa Evans and Blake Moore." I don't know where to start, so I'll begin at the beginning to keep everything in chronological order and hopefully not forget anything important. My name is not significant, but the information I'm conveying to you could profoundly impact the lives of the 2 convicted individuals and the well-being and happiness of 5 others, including myself. Let me start by saying that nearly 15 months ago, a man responded to an ad I had placed in our local newspaper seeking someone with computer expertise to work for my small computer company. A brief interview revealed that he was as knowledgeable about computers and business networks as I was, and I have since learned he knows even more. I hired him immediately. This man, whom I will refer to as Mark throughout this letter, was probably the quietest person I had met in a long time, but it didn't affect his job performance, which was excellent. Within 2 months, my business grew by at least 50% due to his efforts, advice, and the long hours he put in. When he started working for me, he mentioned he had just arrived in the city and had not yet found a place to live. Since my business was still in its early stages, I was considering renting out a room in the basement of our house for extra income. I wanted to reinvest the profits into growing the business to support myself and my young son. I knew I was taking a slight risk by renting the room to Mark, but something about him made me feel he wasn't a threat. We settled into a routine that continues to this day, though the dynamics of our relationship have changed. He spent the first 3 months in that basement room but joined us for meals, and we traveled to work and back together daily. In the beginning, he always returned to the office to work extra hours without asking for additional payment. He consistently said that he preferred to spend his time productively rather than watching television or resting. Over time, our relationship evolved from that of boss and employee to a deep friendship, and eventually to what it is now, a loving family relationship. My son calls him Daddy, and he truly is in every sense. From the very beginning, I sensed something was weighing heavily on Mark. His extremely quiet nature and frequent habit of becoming lost in thought about things I knew nothing about eventually led to a confrontation between us. One afternoon, when the office was quiet, I locked the door and called him into my office, determined to find out what was troubling him. As I began to realize how strong my feelings for him had become, I managed to persuade him to share what was bothering him. He finally revealed that he was escaping from a broken marriage that had deeply affected him. He told me that his wife had betrayed him with a close friend, and it had driven him to the brink of committing both murder and suicide. We continued to talk throughout the day, sharing our experiences with unfaithful partners. My husband had left me for another woman, and Mark had left his wife because of her relationship with another man. We found common ground, and our conversation seemed to help him overcome one of the last barriers to moving on from his past. This conversation also appeared to be the catalyst that brought us closer together. We began dating on weekends, maintaining separate roles as boss and subordinate during the week and as a couple on Saturday evenings. After a month, there was no reason to keep his bedroom in the basement, and he moved into my bedroom with me. From then on, we became a family, although there were still times when I felt like he was concealing something from me. We continued to grow as a couple, and I know I love him and am confident he loves me and my son. I should say our son because that's how he feels about him. The boy was about to turn 4 and needed a loving relationship with his father, something his biological father was unable to provide. He hasn't seen his biological father since he was a baby and too young to remember him. Recently, Mark fainted at work, and after 3 days in intensive care, doctors discovered that he had a heart condition requiring open heart surgery. Once his condition stabilized, he was moved to a different ward where he was conscious, and we could finally talk. When I first entered his room, I could tell something was wrong and deeply troubling him. He then told me a story he feared would remain untold if he didn't undergo surgery. It was crucial for him to close this chapter of his life. He shared his story with me throughout the day, and when I agreed to print it for him and ensure it reached you, it felt like a tremendous weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Now, he is sleeping, and I'm typing this letter at my laptop while our son, who is also asleep next to him, is resting peacefully. I expect to have most of the night to finish this letter. I still need to get home and create a DVD, which I will discuss later, and pick up a few other items before I can send this information to you. I aim to post it by noon tomorrow and also need to resolve the issue of sending it from a location that can't be traced back to us. The story Mark shared began almost 2 years ago. He was happily married to Lisa, and their marriage was approaching its 6-year anniversary. One night, after they had been intimate, Lisa fell asleep without anything on the bed beside him. Mark noticed a small, oval bruise on her right breast. At first, he thought it was just a bruise from a minor accident, perhaps from bumping into furniture at home or at the office where she worked part-time as a secretary. However, the bruise began to bother him because it looked more like a kiss than a bruise, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. The thought kept him awake most of the night, imagining various scenarios about how the bruise might have occurred. The next day, the bruise was still on his mind when he went to work. By the time he reached his office, he had decided he was being irrational, as he had no evidence of wrongdoing. He convinced himself that it must have been an accident. Shortly before lunch, the manager of the parts delivery department came into his office, requesting a tracking device for trial use to better coordinate their delivery fleet. He wanted Mark to evaluate it and provide recommendations. Mark was given the device, software, and instructions for use. It didn't take him long to decide how he would test it. 3 days after installing the device in his wife's car, he was sitting at his desk and decided to check the monitoring program to confirm if it was still tracking her vehicle. She had told him she was going shopping that day, but the tracking device showed that she left the house and went directly to the residence of Blake Moore, his best friend. An hour later, he checked again, and her car was still there. Initially, he found it hard to believe something was wrong, so he called her cell phone. When she told him she was shopping, he immediately knew something was seriously amiss. That night, he casually asked her about her day and listened to her explain the purchases she had made. He said he felt almost physically ill but decided not to jump to conclusions immediately. He chose to monitor her for another week. While he was on a business trip, he tracked her car across 3 states, noting that she spent from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. at Blake's house. When he spoke to her the following day, she insisted she had been home all evening. The confirmation of her infidelity was almost unbearable for him. Upon returning from his trip, he contemplated violent actions. Though he knew Blake was a notorious ladies' man, he had never expected him to pursue Lisa, and his wife's betrayal was heartbreaking. That first night back, he visited an elderly widow who lived next door under the pretense of borrowing a wrench from her late husband's toolkit. Mark knew that her late husband had hidden a gun in the bottom of his large toolbox because his wife had forbidden him from keeping a weapon in the house. The husband had once shown it to Mark when they were drinking beer together. Instead of taking a pipe wrench, Mark retrieved the revolver from the toolbox. He explained to me that his intention was to kill Blake and Lisa and then commit suicide. He planned to wait until the next time they met while he was in town. It would have been easy for him to leave work, go to Blake's place, catch them together, and exact his revenge. Since he needed to monitor his wife's car for a few weeks, he ordered one of the tracking devices for himself to replace the one given for evaluation. He was fortunate that Lisa and Blake didn't arrange their meeting for another week, or my son and I might never have met Mark. During the waiting period, he devised a better plan. He decided to frame them for a crime and detailed to me how he executed it. It took him a week to come up with a plan and another week to gather everything needed for its implementation. When he was ready, he fabricated an excuse to be away for the weekend, confident that Lisa and Blake would meet while he was out of town. After keeping an eye on his wife's car while he was away, he saw her leave and drive to Blake's place. This was his cue to act. He prepared evidence indicating that he was supposedly in the process of divorcing his wife. The final piece was an email to his lawyer that would implicate Lisa and Blake. He nearly forgot to send it, which could have jeopardized the entire plan. The last thing he did before leaving his home was to use a neighbor's revolver to shoot the passenger seat of his car and another wood block he had collected. The gunfire was muffled by an old blanket in the closed garage. He told me that shooting these targets provided him with immense relief, knowing he had begun the path to his revenge. You should look for archived newspaper articles online. Mark followed the trial closely and said much of the account of his actions was covered by court reporters. As he recounted his story, it felt like one continuous narrative. I didn't want to interrupt him, so there might be details I've missed here. Also, obtain a copy of the court transcript, as Mark believes it will clarify everything. He first drove his car to a park near Blake's house, finding a secluded spot to stage his death. He had a large duffel bag with all the necessary items for the plan, which he laid out on a picnic table covered with an old blanket. One of the initial tasks was to arrange pieces of firewood, plastic sheeting, and a spare tire. He used plastic sheeting on which he stacked firewood and the spare tire to create a visible drag mark leading to a paved road. After that, he returned the wheel to the trunk, placed the firewood around the picnic area, and packed away the plastic. He used a small flashlight for the setup and then waited quietly at the table to see if anyone would notice the flashes of light while he worked. While sitting there, he inserted a large needle into his left arm, having procured medical supplies from a store by claiming he was caring for his elderly mother. It took him over an hour to collect what he estimated to be nearly 2 pints of blood. He needs rest as his heart surgery is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I hope that everything goes smoothly and that he recovers well from the surgery. Regardless of whether I have conveyed all the details accurately, there is still the matter of the DVD I am preparing for you. Mark took photos both before and after with his digital camera while setting everything up in the park. Apparently, the photos turned out quite well, even though he had to take them with the light of his small flashlight due to concerns that using the camera's flash might attract attention. Once he finished with the car and the evidence at the park, he packed everything back into his duffel bag and left the park. He had an old car, which he had purchased for this purpose, parked on a side street. Despite drinking plenty of fluids and taking supplements, he felt very dizzy by the time he reached the car. He rested there until 6 a.m., but knew he still needed to visit Blake's house to complete his plan. To his surprise, Lisa's car was still there, and it was unlocked. This proved to be a fortunate break, as it allowed him to leave a few clues on the gas pedal. As he walked from Lisa's car to Blake's, he noticed a faint light in Blake's bedroom, which made him fear that someone might have seen him. After leaving Blake's house, he went to a telephone booth on the opposite side of the park shortly after sunrise. He used a payphone to call 911 and report his car in the park. To disguise his identity, he used a professional voice changer he had bought from a spy shop in Pittsburgh, making the call sound like it came from a woman. Following this, he walked to a dock on the river and discarded 2 Blake scoops and a revolver into the water. By the time he finished this task, he felt extremely tired, though he believed the adrenaline from knowing that his plan hadn't gone seriously wrong had kept him going. About a mile away, there was a small motel where he had rented a room in advance. He spent 2 days there, taking supplements and eating energy bars. Although I was a bit confused about the timing, he later emerged with the voice changer to make another call, this time impersonating an elderly man. This call was intended to direct the police to the revolver he had thrown away. That's all he shared with me. I plan to review it with him in the morning and make any necessary corrections. I hope that when he sees everything is ready for printing, he will feel much more at ease. The reason he told me this story and insisted that I send it to you is that he wants to sever the last ties to his old identity as Mark Evans. Somewhere along the way before reaching this point, he assumed a new identity that my son and I know him by now. He wants to retain this new identity and never be Mark Evans again. Please do everything possible to overturn the convictions of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. Tomorrow, I will buy a copy of the New York Times and a stamp pad. We will use a piece of the first page to leave all of Mark's fingerprints where they can be clearly seen. Then, we will create a large stain on the newspaper, which, when matched with DNA from the park, will prove he is alive. This should be sufficient to secure their release. This completes the computer letter but adds another handwritten note at the bottom. Mark came through the surgery in very good condition. He wants me to fly to Seattle tomorrow to send this package. Although I hate leaving him, I know he will feel much better once this is sent. Earlier, I mentioned that this situation would impact the 5 of us, but I realize I didn't explain what I meant. Mark and I are expecting twins in about 3 months. Tony Kelly turned the last page to see if anything had been added on the back, but it was blank. He lifted his feet from the corner of the table and turned to examine the other items in the package. The DVD was labeled Photographs Taken at George Washington Park. On the back of the black plastic bag was written fingerprints and DNA. He glanced at the printed pages again, checking the back of each for additional entries, and then called one of the senior lawyers. It wasn't a decision he could make alone. It didn't take long to confirm that the DNA matched Mark Evans, and the fingerprints also confirmed he was alive when they were compared to those taken from his car at the park. Faced with overwhelming evidence that the 2 men had been wrongfully convicted of a murder that never occurred, the state attorney general and the governor expedited their release. Within a week, they were back in the courtroom where they were originally convicted, alongside Basil Smith, Lisa's parents, District Attorney Jeff Bugden, and some government officials. The state's attorney general apologized to the court system and the state for the wrongful convictions, stating that there was no doubt the blame for the entire unfortunate affair lay on the shoulders of Mark Evans. The judicial system functioned as intended but was misled from the path of justice by the determined efforts of an individual. The Attorney General then announced that their office would exert every effort to locate Mark Evans and hold him accountable for the substantial costs incurred by the city and state. The expenses associated with police work, forensics, the trial, and imprisonment were being calculated, with intentions to recover them. Charges would also be filed. However, when a reporter inquired if they had any leads on where to start searching for Mark, he simply shook his head. Blakemore appeared to undergo a significant change in demeanor. The confident and self-assured man was replaced by someone much more willing to concede. He apologized to Lisa for the events that led to their nearly year and a half in prison. Lisa, however, seemed indifferent, her reaction neither positive nor negative. She looked utterly devastated, primarily concerned with leaving the courtroom with her parents as quickly as possible. Before departing, B. Smith and the district attorney also offered their apologies for the situation. Both lawyers felt severely misled by Mark Evans' deceptions and believed they should have been more astute to avoid falling for his manipulative schemes. They both resolved to be more vigilant with details in future cases. Although the Attorney General believed the state held no liability, Lisa and Blake each received $50,000 after signing a waiver of any further legal claims or damages. Shortly after receiving his check, Blakemore left town. His business had gone bankrupt, and his house was sold to cover legal fees. With nothing left for him in town, his only comment to Lisa after they received their checks was, "Mark really screwed us over, didn't he? This check is just a fraction of what my house and business would have been worth if he hadn't found out about us. I hate to say I warned you, but I knew he set us up." Lisa was still a mere shadow of her former self. She lost the house she and Mar owned due to non-payment and repossession. She also lost weight in prison and developed noticeable worry lines. She seemed hopelessly lost and accepted her check with a sense of detachment, as if it were no more significant than a piece of paper, stuffing it into her purse. She said, "I think maybe we deserve this, Blake. I don't care about the time in jail. It only cost me 18 months of my life, but I lost Mark forever." She left with her parents without even saying goodbye. 2 weeks after news channels reported on Lisa and Blake's release, a large package arrived by courier at the office of lawyer Basil Smith. Inside was a short note to the lawyer and a sealed envelope addressed to Lisa Evans. He arranged to deliver the letter to her on his way home. At precisely 5 p.m., the lawyer knocked on Lisa's apartment door. After a brief and polite conversation, he left her standing at the door, looking at the envelope with a mixture of concern and faint hope. Finally, after bringing it into the kitchen and staring at it for a few more seconds, she opened it. The familiar handwriting on the envelope revealed it was from Mark, and she knew she had to read what he wrote. "Lisa, I would like to apologize for allowing you to spend so long in prison. I've never been vindictive before, but the betrayal from you and Blake almost drove me to madness. My new life and the happiness I have found have finally made me realize that until I free you both, I am just as much a prisoner as you. I know the authorities will be searching for me for some time, but I am confident that I am safe in my new life with my new family. Good luck and goodbye. M." The short letter fell from her hand to the floor, taking with it the last faint hope of reconciliation with Mark. What do you think of our story today? In my opinion, the husband was both clever and cunning, because not everyone would dare to bug his wife. What do you think? Write it in the comments. See you in the comments.